She pulled a dying child from a sinking car while rain hammered the canal banks, and emergency lights turned the water red and blue. She broke the window with her bare hands, dragged him out, and brought him back from the edge of death with CPR right there in the mud. And when she looked up, soaked, shaking, the boy finally breathing beside her, the first thing she saw was a police officer walking toward her with handcuffs, not to thank her, to arrest her. Her name was Nora Voss. She was 31 years old, a nurse, and until that night, nobody in Caldwell had any idea what she'd once been capable of. They were about to find out. And so was he. If you're watching this from wherever you are in the world, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels, and if it hits you the way I think it will, hit like and follow along. You won't want to miss what happens next. The rain had been coming down since early afternoon, the kind that didn't announce itself with thunder or a shift in the sky. It just arrived, gray and steady, and settled in like it intended to stay. By 7 in the evening, the two-lane road running alongside Briar Canal was slick enough that headlights caught the water sheeting across the asphalt in long, continuous waves. Nora Voss was heading home from a double shift. She drove a 10-year-old sedan with a cracked rear bumper and a heater that worked only when it felt like it. The radio was off. She didn't have the energy for it. 14 hours on her feet in the emergency department at Caldwell Mercy Hospital had left her shoulders tight and her eyes dry, and all she wanted was the 20-minute drive home, a shower, and 6 hours of sleep before doing it again. She almost didn't see the SUV. It happened fast, the way accidents always did, not with a slow unfolding, but with a sudden, terrible compression of time. One moment the road ahead was empty. The next, there were headlights cutting sideways, tires losing traction on the wet road, and then the sound. A grinding, low crash followed by a splash that didn't belong, as the black SUV went off the shoulder and dropped 6 feet into Briar Canal. Nora was stopped before she fully processed it. She didn't remember pulling over. Her body moved ahead of her thinking, the way it had been trained to do a long time ago, in a context far removed from the quiet civilian life she'd spent the last 4 years building. She was out of the car. She was running toward the bank. The canal was maybe 12 feet wide at that stretch, more drainage channel than anything else, but it had depth, enough to swallow a vehicle. And the SUV had already dropped below the waterline on the driver's side, tilted at an angle, passenger side still partly above the surface. The current was working against her before she even hit the water. She went in anyway. The cold punched through her immediately, a full-body shock that most people would have retreated from. She didn't. She got to the vehicle in 4 strokes, grabbed the frame of the passenger door, and pulled herself up enough to see inside. Driver's airbag had deployed. The driver, a woman in her 30s, was conscious but stunned, head moving slowly. In the back seat, there was a child. A boy, maybe 7 or 8, still strapped into his booster seat. The water was already at his shins and rising. Nora tried the door, locked and pressure-sealed by the canal water building against the frame. She scanned the surface around her and found what she needed in 3 seconds. A piece of broken plastic trim that had floated up from somewhere inside the cabin, thick enough at the corner. She used it to strike the passenger window, once, twice, then with her elbow on the 3rd blow, and the glass gave. Safety glass spiderwebbed and collapsed inward. She cleared the frame with her forearm, ignoring the cuts, and reached in. "Hey, kid! Hey, look at me!" The boy was frozen, the way scared children went sometimes. Perfectly still, eyes fixed on the water rising around him. "I need you to unbuckle for me. Can you unbuckle?" His hands moved. They fumbled, but they moved. She had him out in under 40 seconds. The driver was screaming something from the front seat, her name, the boy's name, and Nora registered it, filed it, kept moving. The canal bank was steep on the near side. She got the boy's arms over the edge and pushed him up, scraped her own knee on the concrete lip, and hauled herself after him. He wasn't breathing right. She put him on his back. He'd taken in water, not a lot, but enough. She tilted his head, gave 2 rescue breaths, and started compressions. 30 compressions to the rhythm she'd learned not in nursing school, but before that, in a place where getting the rhythm wrong meant watching someone die in the dirt. Her hands knew what to do without being told. On the 2nd cycle, the boy coughed. Water, then air, then crying. The good kind of crying, the alive kind. Nora sat back on her heels and let out a breath that felt like it had been building for the last 3 minutes. Her hands were bleeding. She was soaked through. The rain was still falling. She heard tires on the road behind her. She assumed it was emergency services. She'd called 911 while she was still running to the bank. A clipped 8-second description of the vehicle, the location, and the situation. And she'd expected them to arrive in the middle of the rescue. They'd arrived 3 minutes after. The first officer out of the patrol car was not moving fast. He walked to the bank with his thumbs hooked in his belt and looked down at the scene. The boy, the broken window, the woman still treading water in the canal. And his face did something Nora couldn't quite categorize. Not concern, not relief, something closer to irritation. His name badge read Garrett Hale. She'd never seen him before. "Ma'am?" He looked at her the way people look at something they've found on the bottom of a shoe. "Did you break that vehicle window?" Nora looked up at him from where she was kneeling over the boy. "The child aspirated water. I need an ambulance. I called for one. They should be—" "I asked you a question." "Yes," she said. "I broke the window. He would have drowned." Hale unclipped his radio and said something into it she couldn't hear over the rain. Then he walked down the bank toward her with a deliberateness that made something in her stomach tighten. Not fear exactly. Something older than fear. The recognition of a situation going wrong. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from the child. He aspirated canal water. I'm a nurse. He needs to be monitored until—" "Step away. Now." She stood up slowly, hands visible. She'd learned that a long time ago, too, the value of visible hands. The second officer, younger, less certain, had gone to the water's edge to check on the driver. Nora could hear him talking to the woman, could hear the woman saying her son's name, asking if he was okay. The boy was okay. The boy was crying and shivering and alive, which was the whole point. Hale took her by the arm, not gently. "You interfered with an active accident scene," he said. "You damaged a vehicle. We're going to need to sort this out." "Sort—" She looked at him. Her child was drowning. "What exactly were you going to sort out?" "Watch your tone." "I'm a registered nurse. I performed an emergency rescue and administered CPR. The child has a pulse and is breathing. You can verify all of that yourself." Hale didn't verify anything. He turned her around, and before the sentence finished forming in her mind, "This isn't actually happening," she felt the handcuffs close around her wrists. The boy she'd saved was watching from 6 feet away, wrapped in a mylar blanket one of the EMTs had produced, his eyes wide and fixed on her. "Hey," Nora said to him before Hale pulled her away. "You did good. You unbuckled. That was you." Hale put her in the back of the patrol car. The door closed. Through the rain-streaked window, she watched the ambulance crew arrive and load the boy onto a stretcher. She watched the mother climb out of the canal with help from the second officer. She watched the EMTs check vitals, communicate with each other, do exactly what she had already done. She sat in the back of that car for 40 minutes before anyone spoke to her again. At the Caldwell PD precinct, they processed her like she was a problem to be filed. Fingerprints, a holding bench, a form she wasn't allowed to read before signing. No one offered her dry clothes. The cuts on her arm from the window glass were still open. She asked for a bandage twice. The second time, a desk officer found her a strip of gauze that was more symbolic than medical. She was charged with destruction of private property and obstruction of emergency services. In 14 years of working in emergency medicine, first in uniform, then in scrubs, she had never been on this side of an incident form. She called her sister from the one allowed phone call. Her sister Priya answered on the second ring, and when Nora explained the situation, there was a long pause before Priya said, quietly, "I'm calling Marcus." Marcus Okafor was a lawyer. He was also one of the few people in Caldwell who knew Nora's full history, and one of even fewer who understood why that history mattered. Nora sat on the bench and waited. Around her, the precinct moved at its own bureaucratic pace. Officers coming and going, a radio dispatcher talking in the continuous flat rhythm of law enforcement communications, a coffee maker that someone ran 3 times in the hour she was there. Ordinary, indifferent. The system processing her like a transaction. She thought about the boy's face when he coughed. That part had gone right. Dad. Marcus arrived at 11 and had her out before midnight. In the car on the way to his office, because he wanted to talk before she went home, and she understood why, he didn't ask her what happened. He'd seen the initial police report. He asked her instead, "How bad are your hands?" "Manageable." "We need photos before you clean them up." She nodded. In his office, under the flat overhead light, she held out her hands and let him photograph them. The palm abrasions from the bank, the cuts along her forearm from the window glass, the bruising already forming around her left wrist where the handcuff had been too tight. "He's going to claim you were belligerent," Marcus said, not looking up from his phone. "I wasn't." "I know, but his report says you refused to comply and made threatening statements." "I told him the child had aspirated water." "That's not how he wrote it." She let that sit for a moment. In her experience, paperwork was where the truth went to get rewritten, and she'd seen it happen in enough context to know exactly how the mechanism worked. What mattered wasn't always what had occurred. What mattered was the version that got filed first. "He didn't go in the water," she said. "I know. He was standing on the bank. The kid was going under and he was standing on the bank with his thumbs in his belt." Marcus looked at her. "Is there any chance there's dash cam footage?" "Both patrol cars. Maybe the traffic camera on the Briar Road intersection. I can't be sure of the angle." He made a note. "I'll file for everything in the morning. In the meantime, don't talk to anyone, not colleagues, not the media if they come to you, not the family of the child, as much as I know you'd want to." "I understand." "And Nora." He set his phone down. "This is going to get complicated. Hale has a record. Not formal, but there's a pattern. He's been named in 3 complaints in 4 years. Nothing that stuck. But the complaints exist." "That's not reassuring." "It's not meant to be. I'm telling you because you need to understand that this isn't just a misunderstanding they'll sort out in the morning." She drove herself home at midnight. In the parking lot of her apartment building, she sat in the car for a few minutes before going in. The rain had finally stopped. The pavement was wet and dark and quiet. She was tired in the particular way that had nothing to do with sleep. The kind of tired that came from being treated like you were invisible, and then worse, being treated like you were the problem. She'd felt it before. In different uniforms, different circumstances, but the same essential dynamic. Someone in authority deciding who was worth listening to before they bothered to check. She went inside. She cleaned her arm properly, wrapped it, took ibuprofen. She slept 3 hours. Well, by 6 the next morning, a 30-second clip of cell phone video had been posted to 3 separate social media accounts. Someone had filmed from the bridge above Briar Canal, not the rescue itself, which had happened below the sightline, but the aftermath. Nora kneeling over the boy coughing, Nora being turned around and handcuffed, the patrol car door closing. The clip didn't have audio, but it didn't need any. By 10 o'clock, it had 40,000 views. By noon, it was 300,000. By the time Nora woke up at 9:30 and checked her phone, there were 17 missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize, 2 from her supervisor at Caldwell Mercy, and 1 from the hospital's administrative office. She called her supervisor first. His name was Dr. Richard Farrow, a practical man who generally said exactly what he meant and meant exactly what he said. He'd been running the emergency department for 11 years. "I need you to come in," he said. "Not for a shift, for a conversation." She knew what kind of conversation before she arrived. Caldwell Mercy Hospital occupied a 7-story building on the north edge of downtown, a structure that looked more like an insurance company than a medical facility, all glass and gray stone. She'd walked through those doors 300 times in the past 2 years. She walked through them now under different circumstances. In civilian clothes, aware that the 2 nurses at the front desk recognized her and had stopped their conversation mid-sentence. Farrow met her in his office on the 3rd floor. The hospital's HR director, a woman named Sylvia Crane, was already there. That told Nora everything she needed to know about how this conversation had been structured before she walked in. "We want to hear your account," Farrow said. So she gave it, methodically. The accident, the timing, the assessment, the rescue, the CPR, the officer's response, the arrest. She was factual and direct, and did not editorialize. Crane took notes. Pharaoh listened with his hands folded on the desk. When Nora finished, neither of them spoke for a moment. "You understand our position," Pharaoh finally said. "I understand that I'm an active criminal defendant in the county's view," Nora said. "I also understand that the charges are without merit and that the child I pulled out of that canal is alive because of what I did. The hospital has protocols for off-duty conduct. I performed emergency CPR on a drowning child. That's not off-duty misconduct. That's basic—" "Nora." Pharaoh's voice was quiet and not unkind, which almost made it worse. "There's video of you being arrested. The hospital has already received 3 calls from board members this morning. The Community Relations Office is getting media inquiries. We need to manage this carefully." "What does carefully mean?" Crane answered. "We're placing you on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending the outcome of the legal proceedings." Nora looked at her, then at Pharaoh. "The legal proceedings that shouldn't exist," she said. "We're not making a determination of guilt," Crane said, which was the kind of sentence that sounded even-handed until you listened to what it was actually saying. "You're making a determination that my presence is a liability. That's different." Neither of them disputed it. She signed what they needed her to sign. She didn't argue further, not because she'd given up, but because she understood that this particular room was not the place where the argument would matter. She thanked Pharaoh for his time, which was both genuine and pointed, and she walked out of the hospital she'd spent 2 years working in without being sure when she'd be back. In the parking garage, she sat in her car and took inventory of the last 18 hours. Arrested, charged, suspended. The boy she saved was alive in a pediatric ward somewhere in this building. She started the car and drove to Marcus's office. By evening, the story had a shape. Not the full shape, that would take days, but enough of one that Nora could see the outline. The video clip kept spreading. People were identifying Officer Garrett Hale by name, finding his social media, finding the 3 prior complaints Marcus had mentioned. Local news had picked it up. A reporter from the Caldwell Register had left a message with Marcus requesting comment. What nobody had yet was the dashcam footage. That footage was still under the control of Caldwell PD, and the department had made no announcement about releasing it. Marcus had filed the formal request that morning. It had been received. Whether it would be honored and how quickly was a different matter. Nora had exactly one piece of information that the public didn't have yet. She hadn't mentioned it to Marcus. She'd been deciding whether to. During the 40 minutes she sat in the back of the patrol car, she had been able to see, through the front windshield, through the rain, the second patrol car and its mounted exterior camera. The camera had been pointing at the bank. Pointing, she was fairly certain, at the exact sequence. The boy coughing, her performing compressions, Hale standing 6 feet away with his hands in his belt. Not helping, just standing there. She told Marcus when she saw him that evening. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalculating. "If that camera caught what you're describing," he said, "the charges dissolve. And everything that follows from this," he gestured at the room, meaning everything, "changes shape completely." "I know." "The department is going to move that footage to internal review. They'll classify it." "They'll try." He leaned back in his chair. "You have friends I don't know about?" "I have—" She paused. "I have people who owe me something. Some of them are in positions where they could make noise about footage suppression if it came to that. That's different from having a legal remedy. It's not instead of a legal remedy, it's in addition to it." He studied her. He'd worked with her for 2 years. Not closely, but on enough administrative matters that he'd built a partial picture. He knew her nursing record, her credentials, her 2 years at Caldwell Mercy. He didn't know everything behind the credentials. She wasn't ready to explain the rest of it yet. She went home. She didn't sleep well. The next morning she got up, made coffee, and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and worked through what she knew, because working through what she knew was the thing she'd always done when everything else was out of her control. She'd been dismissed before, underestimated before, pushed to the margin and told to stay there. She'd never stayed. Somewhere across town, in a pediatric ward she wasn't permitted to visit, a 7-year-old boy was breathing. She'd given him that. Nobody was going to take it back. 4 days after the arrest, Two things happened within hours of each other that changed the shape of everything. The first was the Caldwell Register story. Investigative, not just local interest. A reporter named Dina Marsh had pulled the 3 prior complaints against Hale and found something Marcus hadn't yet. A fourth incident, not formally filed but documented in a civilian letter to the precinct captain 2 years earlier. The letter had been acknowledged and then apparently filed away. In it, a man named Terrell Watts described being detained by Hale for 40 minutes without cause after reporting a car accident, the same way Nora had been detained after saving a child from one. The same pattern, the same officer, different victims. The story ran on page 1. The second thing was the footage, not the official dash cam request. That was still pending, grinding through department process. What surfaced instead was a 10-minute clip posted to an anonymous account, low resolution but unmistakable. Interior forward-facing camera from Hale's own patrol vehicle angled at the canal bank. It showed exactly what Nora had described. The boy, motionless, being pulled from the water. Nora, on her knees, working on him. The CPR, the compression cycle. The moment the boy coughed. And Hale, visible at the edge of the frame, standing on the bank, hands at his sides, watching. Not moving, not helping, not even reaching for his radio until the boy was already breathing and Nora was sitting back on her heels. And then, in the last 90 seconds of the footage, Hale walking toward her. Hale turning her around. Hale closing the cuffs. The clip had 2 million views by midnight. By the following morning, Caldwell PD's Public Information Office had released a statement that was carefully worded enough to say nothing and explain nothing while managing to confirm that an internal review was underway. Marcus called her at 7 a.m. "The DA's office called me an hour ago," he said. "They're reconsidering the charges." She held the phone and looked at the wall. "Nora, I heard you. This is moving faster than I expected. What about Hale?" There was a pause. "That's a separate track. What happens to him depends on internal affairs, the union, the department's appetite for Marcus. He's not going to walk away from this clean. I can tell you that." She exhaled slowly. In the window across the kitchen, morning light was coming through the blinds, making narrow lines across the floor. Ordinary morning. Nothing about the last 4 days had been ordinary, and she understood that the next part wouldn't be either. "There's something else," Marcus said. "Someone reached out to my office last night. Not press, not a civilian, a retired officer, federal, not city, who said he has additional information about Hale. He wants to meet." "Who is he?" "He wouldn't give his name over the phone. He said he'd explain in person." She thought about this. Thought about the pattern. 4 incidents, same officer, the letter that got buried. Thought about what it meant that someone with federal connections was suddenly interested. "Set the meeting," she said. "It could be nothing. It could be someone trying to get close to the story." "Set it anyway." She put the phone down, picked up her coffee, cold now. She thought about the word reconsidering, which was a very small word for a very large failure, but it was something. It was the machinery beginning, reluctantly, to turn. She also thought about the retired federal officer who wouldn't give his name on the phone, and the particular quality of caution that suggested not someone protecting a scoop, but someone protecting themselves. That was a different kind of thing. In the pediatric ward across town, the boy was being discharged that afternoon. His mother had already left 2 messages with Marcus. She wanted to find the woman who had saved her son. She wanted to thank her. She'd been asking since the night of the accident, and no one had told her where to look. Nora wasn't ready for that meeting yet. Not because she didn't want it, but because she'd learned a long time ago that closure wasn't something you reached for while the situation was still moving. You kept your eyes forward. You dealt with what was in front of you. And what was in front of her now was a meeting with a man who wouldn't say his name on a phone, and the growing, specific feeling that what had started as an officer making a bad decision at a canal bank was something considerably more than that. She rinsed her coffee cup. She put on her jacket. She went to find out what it was. The man's name was Conrad Selig, and he had the look of someone who had spent 20 years in federal law enforcement and was still deciding whether that had been a good use of his life. He was in his late 50s, broad across the shoulders, in the way of someone who used to be heavier and had lost the weight without quite losing the frame. His suit jacket was clean but slightly wrong for his body. Off the rack, not recent. He sat in the corner booth of a diner on Mercer Street with his back to the wall and a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. And when Nora walked in with Marcus, he didn't wave. He just watched her until she reached the table, then stood halfway out of his seat in a gesture that was too formal for the setting and seemed to know it. "Miss Voss," he said. "Mr. Selig." She slid into the booth across from him. Marcus sat beside her. The diner was almost empty. A Tuesday morning, gray and cold outside, the kind of day that kept most people somewhere warmer. The waitress topped off nearby coffee cups and drifted away. Selig looked at Marcus. "I'd prefer to speak with her alone." "That's not an option," Marcus said pleasantly. Selig appeared to accept this without much resistance. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at Nora. "I'm going to start with something that might sound strange," he said. "I want you to hear it before I explain the context." "Go ahead." "I've known about Garrett Hale for 2.5 years. I've known he was doing this, not this exactly, not the arrest, but the pattern of it. Detentions without cause, retaliatory filings, intimidation of witnesses in cases he wasn't assigned to. I've known, and I didn't stop it, and now someone needs to understand what that means." The diner was quiet enough that she could hear the cook's radio from the back. She waited. "Why are you telling me?" she asked. "Because you're the first person he did it to who had the ability to make it stick," Selig said. "The others, Watts, a woman named Plimpton, who never filed formally, 2 others I know of, they didn't have footage. They didn't have a lawyer who filed the right requests in the first 48 hours. They didn't have any of it. You have all of it, and that changes the math." "What math?" He looked at his coffee. "There's a group of officers, not just Hale. He's not operating alone. There are 4 of them at the Caldwell precinct, and they have a working relationship with 2 supervisors who look the other way because it's easier than the alternative. What they do isn't coordinated the way a conspiracy gets written up. It's more like shared instincts, shared tolerance. They know what each other does, and they cover for it." Marcus leaned in slightly. "How do you know this?" "Because 18 months ago, I was assigned to a federal task force looking at corruption in regional law enforcement across 4 counties. Caldwell was one of the jurisdictions. We built part of a case, preliminary, not clean enough to take to a grand jury, and then the task force was defunded. Budget decision, nothing political, just the math didn't work anymore. The case went into a drawer." "And you went quiet," Nora said. "I retired," he said, "which is its own kind of going quiet." She looked at him. He had the expression of a man who had already decided something before he walked in, who was saying this not to convince her but to clear something that had been sitting in him for longer than it should have been. "What do you want me to do with this?" she asked. "I want you to let me give Marcus the documentation I kept from the task force. Not all of it. Some is technically still federal property, and I can't hand it over without creating problems for both of us. But my personal notes, my timeline, the names of the other people who were affected and what happened to their complaints. And then what? And then it becomes a much bigger story than a nurse who got arrested at a canal." Marcus spent 2 hours with Selig after the breakfast. Nora drove back to her apartment and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes, not quite ready to go inside, turning over the conversation in her mind. She had been a combat medic attached to the 74th Special Operations Support Group for 6 years. In that time, she had done 12 deployments across 3 theaters, been cited for valor twice, and watched institutional failure up close in ways that most people never encountered. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that made news, but the quiet, ongoing kind where the wrong people were protected for the wrong reasons, and everyone around them learned to work inside the boundaries of that protection because the boundaries were easier to navigate than the truth. She had left the Army at 27 and spent 3 years putting enough distance between herself and that world to build something different, nursing school, Caldwell Mercy. A small apartment and a car with a broken heater and a life that was, by most measures, considerably more ordinary than anything she'd had before. She hadn't expected this. That was the honest version. She hadn't expected that the ordinary life would contain this particular kind of problem. She went inside. She called her sister. Priya picked up on the 3rd ring, which meant she'd seen the name and had taken a breath before answering. That was her pattern when she was worried. "How was the meeting?" Priya asked. "Complicated." More complicated than yesterday? In a different direction. Nora sat on the edge of her bed. It's bigger than Hale. Bigger how? There's a group of them, at least 4 officers and 2 supervisors who've been running interference for years. Someone from a federal task force has documentation. Priya was quiet for a moment. Are you safe? The question landed differently than it might have 2 days earlier. Before the arrest, it would have seemed like an overreaction. Now, with the footage out, and the department under pressure, and the story carrying Hale's name to 2 million views and climbing, she understood why Priya was asking. I think so, she said. For now. Nothing's escalated beyond the charges. The charges they're supposedly reconsidering. Right. Which means they're reconsidering the charges because they have to, not because they want to. And the people who filed them are watching all of this get bigger and waiting to see what they can control. Priya was a social worker. She'd spent 12 years watching institutions decide how much accountability they could absorb before they had to respond. She understood the mechanism better than most. Yeah, Nora said. That's about right. You need to be careful. I know. Not cautious, careful. Careful like you know what's coming before it gets there. But they talked for another 20 minutes. Then Nora made herself eat something. Half a sandwich, which was less than she needed, and opened her laptop to read what was being written about her. The Register story had been picked up by 3 regional outlets and 1 national wire service. The framing was consistent. Nurse arrested after saving drowning child. Police footage reveals officer in action. Hale's name was everywhere. The department's ongoing internal review statement had been reproduced 17 times across various articles, which meant it had done exactly nothing to calm the coverage. What she noticed, reading carefully, was that no one yet had the full picture. No one had Selig, or the task force, or the group of officers, or the supervisor who'd buried the Watts letter. The story the public had was a story about one bad cop at a canal bank. That story was large and it was real and it was already doing damage. The actual story was larger. She didn't know yet whether larger was better or worse for her specifically. The charges were formally dropped 6 days after the arrest. Marcus called her at 8 in the morning, and she could tell from the first syllable that it was good news. Not because his voice changed much, but because it didn't change at all, which was how he delivered things he'd been waiting to say. District Attorney's Office filed the withdrawal this morning, he said. Destruction of property and obstruction. Both dropped. No conditions, no deferred prosecution, clean dismissal. She pressed her back against the kitchen counter and stared at the ceiling for a few seconds. Okay, she said. That's all you've got? I have more. I'll get to it. What happens now? Now I send a formal letter to Caldwell Mercy requesting reinstatement, citing the dismissal and the documented absence of any misconduct. Crane will push back. Farrow might not. We'll see which one is louder. And Hale. Internal Affairs review is ongoing. The department isn't talking publicly about what the outcome will be. But 3 city council members have called for his suspension, and there's going to be a public comment meeting at City Hall next week. He's not walking away from this quietly. She thought about the folder of notes Selig had handed to Marcus in the parking lot after the diner meeting. The timeline. The names. The supervisor who'd classified the Watts complaint without forwarding it to oversight. The Selig documentation, she said. Where does that go? I've shared it with an investigative journalist at the Register, Dina Marsh. She's been working the story anyway. She's thorough, and if the department tries to bury anything else from the internal review, she'll know how to find it. I'm also sending copies to the County Oversight Board and the State Attorney General's Public Integrity Unit. That's a wide net. It needs to be. If this is what Selig says it is, then the city's internal process isn't enough. We need external pressure from multiple directions so they can't quietly consolidate it. She was quiet for a moment, thinking about pressure and direction and the ways systems resisted accountability when they were allowed to manage the process themselves. She'd seen it happen in the Army. Not the same kind of corruption, but the same instinct. The closed loop. The internal review that exonerated the internal reviewer. There's something I haven't told you yet, she said. He waited. Before I left the Army, I spent 2 years working with a Special Operations Medical Unit. Not as a nurse, as a combat medic, certified at the 68 WW level. with additional qualifications that don't have civilian equivalents. I served under a commander named Delaney, who is currently a colonel at Fort Harwell, which is 4 hours from here. Why are you telling me this now? Because if this case goes to a formal hearing, if Hale challenges the internal review findings, if the department tries to push back on the documentation, if it ends up in front of a panel, it's going to matter who speaks for me. And the people who can speak to what I know, what I've done, what my judgment is actually worth, they're not at Caldwell Mercy. They're at Fort Harwell and 2 other installations and 1 embassy that I'm not supposed to know I know about. Marcus was quiet long enough that she could hear him breathing. Are you saying you can get military character witnesses? I'm saying that if it becomes necessary, I know people who would show up for this. I haven't called them. I'm not going to unless it becomes necessary. Let's hope it doesn't. I'm hoping, she said. I'm not counting on it. Caldwell. Mercy took 8 days to respond to Marcus's reinstatement letter. The response was not a yes. It was, legally speaking, a structured delay, a request for additional documentation regarding the circumstances of the arrest, the specific actions taken at the scene, and whether Nora had followed hospital protocol for off-duty emergency conduct, which was a section of the employee handbook so rarely invoked that 3 HR staffers apparently had to look it up to confirm it existed. Marcus sent back a 10-page response that addressed each point with the unhurried precision of someone who had anticipated every question. He'd been preparing the document since before the charges were dropped. Nora had reviewed it twice and noted that it was, in its own way, a kind of controlled demolition, each section taking apart a justification the hospital might use to keep her suspended and leaving nothing behind. She didn't hear back for another 5 days. During that time, the story continued to move. Dina Marsh published a second piece in the Register that drew a direct line between the Watts incident, the buried complaint letter, the 2 other names from Selig's notes, a woman named Lena Ortega, who'd been detained without cause in 2021, and a man named Declan Mather, who'd had a misconduct report filed against him by Hale after he'd attempted to report Hale to the precinct captain, and the supervisor who had processed all 4 complaints without escalating any of them. That supervisor's name was Captain Roy Esterhauer. The day the Marsh piece ran, Esterhauer went on leave. Not suspended. Leave. The department described it as voluntary pending the internal review process, which was a sentence that managed to mean very little, while technically meaning something. Nora read the article in her apartment with a cup of coffee and a feeling that was not satisfaction. It was too early for that, and she'd been in enough situations to know that things that looked like turning points sometimes turned in the wrong direction. But it was something close to vindication moving in the distance, something in the shape of it, at least. She called Priya. Esterhauer's gone, she said. I saw. It's not over. It's also not nothing. No, she agreed. It's not nothing. 3 days later, she got a call from a number she recognized immediately, an 843 area code, Fort Harwell. She picked up before the second ring. The voice on the other end was Colonel Adria Delaney, and she did not begin with pleasantries because she never had. I've been watching the news, Delaney said. I want to know what you actually need. Nothing yet, Nora said. Possibly something soon. I've already talked to Reyes and Obi. They're both available. Captain Louis Reyes, Sergeant Major Kwame Obi, 2 of the people who'd been with her in the field when what she'd done there had actually mattered. You didn't have to do that, Nora said. I know. Tell me what you need when you need it. The call lasted 4 minutes. She sat with the phone in her hand after it ended and didn't quite know what to do with what she felt, which was not relief exactly, but something adjacent to it. The recognition that she was not navigating this alone, that there were people who knew her actual record and would say so if it became necessary. She hadn't asked them. They'd called. Yet, the request arrived 2 weeks after the arrest. Not from the hospital, not from Marcus. From Caldwell PD's Internal Affairs Division, through official channels, a formal request for Nora to submit to a voluntary interview regarding the events of the night in question. Voluntary in this context meant that she could decline. It also meant that declining would be noted. Marcus read her the request over the phone and then was quiet for a moment. They're building a record, he said. For the department or for Hale? Both. If Hale contests his findings through the union grievance process, they'll want documentation that they did due diligence. If Esterhauer fights the leave, same thing. Your interview becomes part of their paper trail. Which means they're preparing for Hale to fight the findings. It means they're preparing for the possibility. She thought about this. The union had already issued one statement, carefully worded, about the importance of due process for officers. The precinct captain, a man named Faraday, who had said nothing publicly in the 2 weeks since the arrest, had finally given a brief interview to a television station in which he described the department as committed to accountability, which was the kind of sentence that had been evacuated of all meaning through overuse. "I'll do the interview," she said, "with me present." "Obviously. And you only answer what they ask, nothing additional." "I know how to do this." "I know you do," he said. "I'm saying it anyway." The interview was scheduled for a Thursday. On Wednesday evening, Dina Marsh called Marcus's office, not Nora directly, because Marsh was careful that way, with information she wanted Nora to be aware of before the interview. Marcus relayed it to Nora that night. One of the 4 officers in Selig's documentation had resigned that afternoon, not Hale. A younger officer named Pelter, who had been connected to 2 of the incidents Selig had documented, and who had, according to Marsh's sources, been told by the union that his situation was distinct from Hale's, and that the grievance process would not cover him. In other words, the structure was beginning to sort out who it would protect and who it would let go. Hale, apparently, was still in the protected category. For now. Nora sat with this on Wednesday night and felt the shape of the next part coming, not clearly, not in detail, but she could feel the weight of it. 2.5 weeks since the canal. Charges dropped, hospital still stalling, 1 officer gone, 1 on leave, Hale still technically employed with the protection of a union that had decided he was worth the fight. The documentation spreading through official channels, the story continuing to run. It wasn't over. It wasn't close to over. She went to bed at 10, set her alarm for 6. She had an interview to give in the morning, and she intended to be precise. She was reaching to turn off the bedside lamp when her phone lit up. Not a call. A text. From a number she didn't recognize, no contact name, no area code she could immediately place. 4 words. "Withdraw your complaint. Tonight." She stared at it. Then she took a screenshot, forwarded it to Marcus, and called him. He picked up on the first ring. Marcus didn't say anything for the first few seconds after she read him the text. She could hear him breathing, hear the faint sound of a chair moving, which meant he'd been awake, which meant he'd been working late enough that the call hadn't pulled him out of sleep. "Forward it to my email," he said. "Not just the screenshot. The original message. I need the full metadata." "Already sent." "Don't respond to it." "I wasn't going to." "I'm not assuming anything tonight. Don't respond, don't delete, don't touch your phone settings. I'm going to call a contact at the county DA's office, not the one handling your case, a different one, and find out how to preserve this as evidence before anyone does anything else." She sat on the edge of her bed with the phone warm against her ear and looked at the 4 words still lit on her screen. "Withdraw your complaint. Tonight." She'd received threats before, not often and not like this, not civilian, not text message at 11 p.m. In the Army, threat assessments came through channels with protocols and response hierarchies. This was different. This was someone with her number, her name, and enough information to know that the complaint she'd filed with the county oversight board was the specific piece they wanted gone. "Marcus?" she said. "Yeah. Whoever sent this knows about the oversight complaint. That's not public." A pause. "You're right. The complaint went to the board 3 days ago. You filed it. I know who you sent copies to. The DA's integrity unit, Marsh. But not her number, her editor. And Selig." Selig. Another pause, longer this time. "I'm not drawing a conclusion yet." "I'm not either," she said. "I'm just noting the list is short." She set her phone face down on the nightstand when the call ended. She didn't sleep for a long time. Not because she was afraid, exactly. Fear had a particular texture she'd learned to recognize, something that moved fast and shallow. But because she was doing what she always did when the variables shifted, running through it. Who had access? Who had motive? What the next move looked like if she were on the other side of this and trying to slow a story that was picking up weight with every news cycle. Threatening her directly was not a smart play. It was a scared play. Whoever had sent it was running out of the kind of time that could be managed quietly. That was, in its own way, useful information. She gave the internal affairs interview the next morning at 9. Marcus sat beside her in a conference room on the second floor of the precinct building, the building that housed the same department, the same institution that had arrested her 22 days earlier, and she answered every question with the flatness of someone who had been through enough debriefs to know that precision was a form of protection. The two IA investigators were professional and largely unreadable. One of them, a woman named Ardell, led most of the questions. The other took notes. They asked about the night of the accident in sequence, what she'd seen, what she'd done, what she'd said to the officer, what the officer had said to her. They asked about her medical background. They asked whether she'd identified herself as a medical professional before performing CPR. I identified myself as a registered nurse, she said. I said it clearly, to the officer, within 30 seconds of him approaching me. And the officer's response. He asked if I had broken the vehicle window. What did you say? I said yes, and explained why. Ardell wrote something. Were you aware at the time that Officer Hale had already called for medical support? I was aware that the child was not breathing normally, and that I was the only person present with clinical training. I didn't stop to assess what calls had or hadn't been made. In retrospect, do you believe your actions were appropriate? She looked at the woman steadily. The child is alive. I don't need retrospect to answer that. Ardell moved on without reaction. They went through another 40 minutes of questions. Marcus intervened twice, once when a question mischaracterized her account of Hale's approach, once when they asked her to speculate about Hale's intentions, which was not something she was willing to do in a recorded session. At the end, Ardell closed her folder and thanked them for their time with the practiced neutrality of someone who was good at not telling you anything. In the hallway after, Marcus steered her past two officers who were standing near the elevator, not watching them, but aware of them, and said nothing until they were outside. The question about whether Hale had called for medical support, he said, I noticed it too. They're building a case that he was already managing the scene appropriately, that you were an unnecessary variable. 22 days ago, the DA called me an unnecessary variable. Today, the charges are gone. I know. I'm telling you what they're building, not whether it'll hold. She stopped at the bottom of the precinct steps and tilted her head back for a moment, taking in cold air. The sky was white and flat, the kind of late autumn sky that gave nothing away about what the rest of the day intended to do. The text, she said. I talked to my DA contact last night. He's treating it as potential witness intimidation and running the number. It was a prepaid, probably disposable, but they can still pull cell tower data if they get a warrant, and the content itself is enough to justify asking for one. How long does that take? Long enough that whoever sent it can replace the phone 3 times if they want to. She thought about that. It came from inside the information loop. That's the point that matters. Unless Selig leaked. Why would he leak? He came to us. He handed over his notes voluntarily. If he wanted this buried, he had easier ways. People do contradictory things when they get scared. He wasn't scared. He was guilty. That's different. Marcus looked at her. You've thought about people under pressure before. For several years, she said. It was most of what I did. The Caldwell Register ran Dina Marsh's third piece 4 days later. This one didn't focus on Hale. It focused on Esterhauer, on the specific chain of decisions that had buried 4 separate complaints without oversight escalation, and on a 5th name Marsh had found through public records, a corrections officer named Darnell Fitch, who had filed an internal report about Hale in 2020 and been transferred to a different county facility within 3 weeks of filing it. Fitch agreed to speak on the record. That was the part that changed things. The piece ran on a Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, the County Oversight Board had issued a statement confirming that it had opened a formal investigation into Esterhauer's handling of officer misconduct complaints. By Friday evening, 3 members of the city council had publicly called for Hale's termination pending the outcome of the investigation, not merely his suspension. Nora read the piece and the responses at her kitchen table and felt the shift. Not a dramatic one, but a structural one. The story had moved from Nora being wronged to system that wronged her. That was the transition that mattered, because it meant she was no longer the primary subject. She was the catalyst. The story was now bigger than what had happened to her at the canal bank, and bigger stories had their own momentum. Her phone rang at 4:30. Not Marcus, not Priya, not a number she knew. She answered. "Miss Voss?" The voice was male, middle-aged, and had the careful flatness of someone who had rehearsed the opening of this sentence. "My name is Gareth Tull. I'm calling on behalf of Captain Hale's legal representation." She didn't say anything. "We'd like to explore whether there's an opportunity for a resolution that addresses your concerns without requiring further public proceedings." "My concerns," she said. "The situation has been distressing for everyone involved. Captain Hale recognizes that the night in question—" "Officer Hale," she said. "He hasn't been a captain since Monday, according to the department's own communication." A brief silence. "Officer Hale recognizes that the events were unfortunate. We'd like to discuss—" "Call Marcus Okafor," she said. "He's my attorney. I don't take calls directly." She hung up. She sat with the phone on the table for a moment, then picked it up and texted Marcus. "Hale's attorney just called me directly. I hung up and referred to you." His response came in 40 seconds. "Good. They're trying to settle. That means they're scared of what Marsh has next." She put the phone down, looked at the window. The afternoon light was going flat and thin, the particular quality of November light that made everything look slightly less resolved than it had an hour before. 3 days later, she went back to work. Not at Caldwell Mercy. The hospital's review was still technically ongoing, which was its own ongoing absurdity. But Marcus had connected her with a community health clinic on the south side of the city called Meridian Street Clinic, which served a largely uninsured population and was chronically understaffed and had been for years. The clinic director, a physician named Dr. Soo-Yeon Park, had called Marcus after the second Marsh article and asked if Nora would be interested in working part-time while her hospital situation resolved. "She doesn't need to be hired," Park had told Marcus. "She can volunteer, she can consult, whatever keeps it clean legally. I just need someone who knows what they're doing in an exam room." Nora had said yes immediately. Not because she needed the structure, though she did. Because the clinic was full of people whose situation was similar to the boy in the canal. Not drowning, but close to the edges, where the system's interest in helping them was limited, and what mattered was whoever showed up and didn't turn away. She started on a Tuesday. Triage, wound management, intake assessments. The exam rooms were small and the equipment was older than she was used to, and there was never quite enough of anything. Gloves, gauze, time. She worked 6-hour shifts and came home tired in the way that felt earned. Park was compact and direct and ran the clinic like someone who had long ago made peace with doing more with less. She didn't ask Nora about the arrest or the footage or any of it. On Nora's third day, she handed her a half-finished patient chart and said, "Second exam room, possible radial fracture, patient is 8 years old and terrified." And that was the whole of the orientation. She liked the woman immediately. On her 5th day in the clinic, a man came in through the side entrance that wasn't supposed to be used during hours. She was in the hallway with a chart when she heard the door, and she looked up because the sound was wrong. Not the front door's pneumatic release, but the emergency side exit, which was push bar only and should have been alarmed. The alarm wasn't sounding, which meant either it was malfunctioning or someone had disabled it. The man was in his 60s, large through the chest and shoulders. He was wearing civilian clothes, a dark jacket, jeans, and he moved with the particular economy of someone who had done this kind of thing before. His hands were visible, which was the first thing she checked. His right hand was at his side. His left was slightly behind him. She knew immediately. She set the chart on the counter without rushing, the way you didn't rush when you needed whoever was in front of you to keep thinking they had control of the situation. "Clinic's through the front entrance," she said. He looked at her. "Nora Voss." Not a question. "You've got the wrong room," she said. "Administration is back that way." He took 2 steps toward her. The left hand came around, and she saw what she'd already known was there. A compact semi-automatic, not at full extension, held low and pointed at the floor in the way of someone who wanted the threat communicated without making the commitment visible to any camera that might be watching. "You need to stop what you're doing," he said. His voice was flat and practiced in the way of someone who'd had this conversation before, in different forms. All of it. The lawyer, the journalist, whatever you gave that federal guy. You pull back now, and this ends. She looked at him. Her pulse had gone up. She could feel it, the familiar spike, the specific narrowing of attention that happened in moments that required her to be better than scared. "You came here," she said, "to a clinic, full of patients. That's on you. How do you know Selig?" His expression shifted, barely, a fraction. And in that fraction, she had her answer. He wasn't Hale's man. He was Esterhauer's. He was older than the network she'd been thinking about, which meant Esterhauer's connections went further back than the task force documentation had captured. "Last time," he said, "I'm not withdrawing anything." Her voice was steady. She was aware of the hallway behind her, of the exam room doors, of the fact that Park was somewhere in this building and that there were 8 patients in the waiting room and a 12-year-old kid in exam 3 whose mother was sitting next to him reading a magazine. "That's not the smart answer. It's the only one I have." He raised the weapon, and then the side door opened behind him. Not one person, 4. In tactical gear with weapons already at full extension, and a voice that carried the absolute authority of someone who had trained for exactly this. "Down, hands, now." The man dropped the weapon before the sentence finished. His knees hit the floor 2 seconds later. The clinic hallway went from silence to controlled chaos in the span of a breath. Agents moving through the space, voices communicating position and status. The man being cuffed with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this enough times to have removed all unnecessary movement from the process. Nora stood where she was. Didn't move. Kept her hands visible. One of the agents, a woman, her jacket stenciled with federal markings, stepped toward her. "Ms. Voss, are you injured?" "No." "We need you to step outside. We'll explain in a few minutes." She followed the woman to the clinic's front entrance, past the waiting room where every patient had gone silent and still, past the reception window where the admin staffer was standing with both hands pressed flat on the desk, past Park, who was in the doorway of her office with an expression that contained about 6 distinct reactions happening simultaneously. Outside in the cold, there were 3 more vehicles, federal, unmarked. A man in a dark overcoat was waiting for her on the sidewalk. He had the organized stillness of someone in charge, and when he saw her, he walked toward her with the kind of focused purpose that meant this wasn't a coincidence, that none of this was. "Ms. Voss," he said, "I'm Special Agent Dennis Harlow, Federal Organized Crime and Public Corruption. We've had eyes on Warren Cade for 6 weeks." He paused. "The man inside. We've been waiting for him to move." She looked at him. "You used me as bait," she said. It wasn't quite an accusation. It was just the correct identification of what had happened. Harlow met her eyes. "We didn't arrange your situation. We monitored it. When it became clear Cade was going to act, we had a choice. We could warn you and risk him going quiet, or we could let it run and be in position. You let it run." "We were in position," he said. "You were never in actual danger. I'm a nurse in a clinic hallway. I had a gun pointed at me." "You were not in danger," he said again, and this time something in his voice suggested that he had rehearsed this sentence and that rehearsing it hadn't made it entirely comfortable to say. She looked at the clinic entrance, at the agent still moving inside, at the street behind her, empty and cold and ordinary in a way that the last 4 minutes had been entirely not. "Warren Cade," she said. "Who is he to Esterhauer?" Harlow was quiet for just long enough. "He's his brother-in-law," he said. "And he's the reason your 4-complaint pattern was only 4. There were 9. Cade helped bury the other 5 before they reached Esterhauer's desk. 9. She did the arithmetic on what 9 meant. 9 people, 9 incidents, years of it, buried twice before it could even become the kind of record that someone like Selig might eventually find. So it wasn't just officers and supervisors, she said. "No." Harlow looked at her steadily. "It was bigger than that. It's been bigger than that for a long time. Behind her, through the clinic's glass front door, she could see Park moving between agents, talking, pointing, managing her clinic with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything else. The 12-year-old's mother had her arm around her son in the waiting room. Everyone was okay. For now. For this moment. Nora looked at Harlow. "What happens next?" she asked. Harlow didn't answer her question right away. He looked at the clinic entrance for a moment, then back at her. And when he spoke, it was with the deliberate pacing of someone who had decided how much to say and was sticking to that decision. "You go home," he said. "Tonight, you go home. Tomorrow, you come in and give a formal statement. The arrest of Warren Cade opens a federal case that has been in progress for 6 weeks, and your testimony is one piece of it. Significant, but one piece. The rest of this moves on its own track now. Esterhauer will be addressed. Hale is part of the same case." She looked at him steadily. "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have right now." He held her gaze. "I understand that's not satisfying. I'm telling you what I can." She went home. She sat in her apartment at 8 in the evening with the lights on and her jacket still on and a cup of tea she'd made and not touched. And she thought about 9. 9 people. 9 incidents. The math of what it took to build that kind of structure. Not genius, not sophistication, just patience and access and the reliable tendency of institutions to protect themselves over the people they were supposed to serve. She thought about the first 4 months after she'd left the army, sitting in a studio apartment in a city where she didn't know anyone, trying to figure out what she was supposed to do with the particular set of skills she'd spent 6 years building in contexts that no longer applied. She'd chosen nursing because it was the closest civilian equivalent to what she actually knew how to do: assess, stabilize, keep someone alive long enough for the next thing. She'd been good at it. She'd thought that would be enough. She was still thinking when Priya called at 9:30. "Are you okay?" Priya asked. Physically, yes. That's not what I asked. "I know." She looked at the untouched tea. There were 9 people, not 4. The network buried 5 more before they even got to Esterhauer's desk. 9 people who filed something or said something or tried to do the right thing and got handled. Priya was quiet for a moment. And now? And now there's a federal case, and a man in custody, and 2 people I've never met deciding how much of this becomes public and when. Is that bad? It means the part I can control just got smaller. Nora? Priya's voice had the particular quality it got when she was about to say something she'd already said before and knew she'd have to say again. The part you could control was always small. You pulled a kid out of a canal. Everything after that. You've been managing the fallout. You haven't been running the situation. I know. So let the federal agents run theirs. She picked up the tea. It was cold. She drank it anyway. That's the hardest part, she said. Warren Cade was charged the following morning with criminal intimidation, possession of an unregistered firearm, and obstruction of a federal investigation. The charging document was 12 pages and did not use words like allegedly with any particular frequency. Nora gave her formal statement to Harlow and a second agent named Tessa Vroom at the federal building downtown. The interview took 3 hours and covered the text message, the clinic encounter, her read of Cade's connection to Esterhauer, and the complete timeline of her involvement from the canal bank forward. Marcus sat beside her. Vroom took notes on a laptop with a speed that suggested she was not writing everything down, but was selecting with precision, which Nora recognized as the behavior of someone building a case architecture rather than a record. When they finished, Harlow walked them to the elevator. In the hallway, with no one else around, he said to Nora, "The text message came from a phone purchased at a convenience store in Caldwell 3 weeks ago. The tower data puts it 2 blocks from the precinct." She absorbed that. Not Cade. Different phone, different location, similar timing. We're not certain yet. "Haley," she said. "We're not certain," he said again. But she could see in the quality of his not certainty that he was considerably more certain than he was telling her. In the elevator, Marcus said nothing until the doors closed. Then he said, "They're building to something larger. Cade is the lever. They're going to use his arrest to pressure someone higher up the chain. Esterhauer." Or someone above Esterhauer? How far up does this go? Marcus looked at the elevator doors. I don't know. But Harlow's team has been running for 6 weeks. That's not a reactive investigation. That's a case they started before your arrest, before the footage, before any of this. They started before me, she said slowly. You accelerated it. The footage, the public attention, it gave them something they didn't have before. Pressure from outside the system while they were working inside it. The elevator opened. She walked out into the lobby of the federal building, past the security desk, out into the cold morning air, and stood on the sidewalk processing the particular feeling of being useful in a way you hadn't been consulted about. She wasn't angry about it. She understood it. She just needed a minute to sort it out from the things she felt about it. The Caldwell Register ran the Cade arrest story the same afternoon it hit the public docket. Marsh had been monitoring federal filings, the sign of a reporter who'd been expecting something. And her piece went up at 3 p.m. with more detail than the official press release, including Cade's relationship to Esterhauer and the fact that he was connected to complaint suppression going back to 2019. By 5 p.m., Esterhauer's attorney had released a statement. It described his client as cooperative, committed to accountability, and in ongoing dialogue with investigators, which was a sentence that translated, in the language Nora had learned to read over the past several weeks, as, he is negotiating. By 7 p.m., Hale's union representation had issued its own statement. It was shorter and more defensive in tone, and it contained the phrase unsubstantiated allegations, which had the specific energy of a legal strategy still deciding which direction to run. Marcus sent her both statements with a single-line message. They're separating. Esterhauer is cutting a deal. Hale is going to be left without cover. She read it twice. Then she wrote back. How long? His response came 3 minutes later. Days, not weeks. 4 days later, on a Thursday morning, Roy Esterhauer walked into the federal building on Mercer Street with his attorney and spent 6 hours in a conference room on the 4th floor. Nora knew this because Marsh texted Marcus, who texted her. She was at the Meridian Street Clinic when the texts arrived, finishing a wound assessment on a 43-year-old construction worker whose employer had been sending him back to work after injuries without proper clearance. She finished the assessment, documented it carefully, because documentation was the thing, always the thing, and then stepped into the supply closet for 2 minutes to read her phone. Esterhauer was cooperating. That was the word Marcus used. The full scope of what cooperation meant in this context would take weeks to establish, but the basic architecture of it was becoming clear. Esterhauer had information about Hale, Pelter, 2 other officers, and at least 1 administrator above him in the chain who had known about the complaint suppression and had benefited from it. That last part, the administrator above him, was the new piece. She came out of the supply closet and went back to the exam room and explained to the construction worker why he needed to stop going back to work, when his employer told him to and start listening to what his body was actually reporting. He was not fully convinced. She gave him 3 printed sheets of documentation he could use if his employer pushed back and told him to bring them to his next appointment. That evening, Marcus called with a name. Deputy Director of Public Safety, he said. Not police, not the precinct. The city's Public Safety Administrative Office. A man named Howard Strack. He's been in that position for 11 years. How is he connected? According to what Esterhauer has apparently given the federal investigators, Strack was informed about the complaint suppression program in 2020 and chose not to act. In exchange for that non-action, Hale and Cade provided him with information about his political opponents. Private investigators, essentially, doing opposition research using police resources. She sat with this for a moment. That's not just corruption, that's organized abuse of public office. For at least 4 years, based on the timeline they're building. She thought about Selig, sitting in the diner with his cold coffee and his expression of a man trying to unload something he'd been carrying longer than was good for him. She thought about the task force that had gotten defunded, the case that had gone into a drawer, and the particular way that institutional failure worked, not with a dramatic decision but with a series of small ones, each one easier to make because the one before it had already been made. Strack is going to be arrested, she said, probably within the week. The investigators are moving quickly now that Esterhauer is cooperating. They have records, they have phone logs, they have financial transfers that are going to be very difficult to explain. And Hale. Hale's union dropped his grievance this afternoon. She hadn't expected that to land the way it did. She'd known it was coming. Marcus had said days, not weeks, but hearing it stated plainly still required a moment. They left him, she said. The moment Esterhauer walked into that building, Hale became a liability instead of an asset. The union's job is to protect membership in aggregate. Hale fighting a federal corruption case with no institutional backing is not a fight they're willing to fund. What happens to him now? He's facing departmental termination proceedings, which without union representation, he has very limited ability to contest. He's also a named subject in the federal investigation, which means he may be looking at charges of his own depending on what Esterhauer's cooperation produces. He arrested me, she said, at a canal bank in the rain for saving a child. I know. I want to make sure that specific fact stays in every document. I want it on the record in language that doesn't get buried in the larger case. It's in my filing with the County Oversight Board. It's in your formal federal statement. It's in every public record associated with this. It's not going anywhere. She exhaled. Okay. There's one more thing, Marcus said. Caldwell Mercy called my office today. She straightened slightly. Sylvia Crane. She said the board has concluded its administrative review and would like to schedule a meeting to discuss your return to the emergency department. The clock on Nora's kitchen wall ticked 3 times in the silence. Concluded, she said. Their word. 2.5 weeks ago, they were requesting additional documentation about whether I followed off-duty protocol. 2.5 weeks ago, a man named Warren Cade had not been arrested in connection with a federal corruption investigation. The board's reading of the situation has apparently adjusted. She thought about walking out of that hospital in civilian clothes, past the 2 nurses at the front desk who'd gone quiet when they saw her, past Pharaoh's door without stopping. The particular quality of that walk. Not dramatic, just the mundane experience of being discarded. When is the meeting? She said. They proposed Monday. Tell them Tuesday. I have a shift at the clinic Monday morning. There was a brief pause. I'll tell them Tuesday. Howard Strack was arrested on a Friday morning, 8 days after Esterhauer's cooperation became the mechanism that drove the investigation's final phase. 3 federal agents arrived at the Public Safety Administrative Office on Caldwell's City Hall complex at 8:15 a.m. and escorted him out through the building's main entrance. Not a side door, not a parking garage, the main entrance. Past 3 security cameras that were recording, past a city employee who filmed it on her phone, and past a small group of journalists who had been tipped that something was happening and had been standing on the steps for 40 minutes. The footage of Strack in handcuffs ran on every regional news broadcast and 2 national ones by noon. Nora saw it at the clinic, on a small television in the break room between patients. Park came in while it was running, poured coffee without looking at the screen, and then looked at the screen. That's your case, Park said. Not a question. Part of it. Park watched for another moment. How many people? 9 that I know about. Possibly more. Park drank her coffee. She had the look of someone who had been working in underserved community health long enough to have a very specific relationship with the word systemic. The people who get told to stop making noise, she said, they usually don't have lawyers who file requests within 48 hours. No, Nora said, they usually don't. Park nodded once and went back to her patients. Nora went back to hers. Garrett Hale was formally terminated from the Caldwell Police Department on the following Monday. A 6-line statement from the department's Public Information Office that described the action as the result of a comprehensive internal review and contained no apology and no acknowledgement of the specific harm that had been done. Marcus sent it to her with a note. Expect formal charges within 30 days. She read it and put her phone down. The termination was not the end. She'd known that for weeks. But it was the specific, documented public removal of the person who had put handcuffs on her while a child was coughing canal water 12 feet away, and that had its own weight. Tuesday morning, she drove to Caldwell Mercy. The meeting was in a conference room on the administrative floor, which was different from Pharaoh's office, where the first conversation had happened. More formal, more deliberately arranged, a longer table with 5 chairs instead of 2. Crane was there. Pharaoh was there. 2 board members she hadn't seen before. A man named Kellert and a woman named Dubuisson, who had the specific energy of people who'd been brought in to represent the institution's best face. Marcus sat beside her. Kellert opened with a prepared statement about the hospital's commitment to supporting medical professionals and its recognition that the events of the previous weeks had been challenging for all involved. It was the kind of sentence that would have made her angry 3 weeks earlier. Now she sat through it with the patience of someone who understood that this was the form the apology took when institutions apologized, not to the person they'd failed, but to the situation, in language that distributed the failure evenly across everyone present so that no one in particular had to own it. Crane slid a document across the table. We'd like to offer you reinstatement to your position in the emergency department, effective immediately, with full back pay for the period of administrative leave. Nora looked at the document. She didn't pick it up. And the letter, Marcus said. Crane glanced at Kellert. Kellert produced a second document, a single page on hospital letterhead addressed to Nora, acknowledging that her actions on the night of the canal rescue had been consistent with her professional training and ethical obligations, and that the administrative leave had been issued in error. Nora read it. It was exactly what Marcus had specified in his correspondence. The language was precise and unambiguous and would survive being read by a journalist or a court. She signed the reinstatement paperwork. She took the letter. She did not thank anyone for their time, which was a choice she made deliberately and without visible hostility. She simply stood up, collected the documents, and walked out. In the elevator, Marcus said, "You could have said something." "I know." "Something small. They're scared of you now." "I know that too." The elevator opened. She walked toward the exit. Fear isn't the same as accountability. They're scared of the situation. That's not the same as understanding what they did. "No," he agreed. "It's not." Outside, she called Priya. "Hospital reinstated me," she said, finally. "With back pay and a letter." That's good. That's what you needed." "It is." She stood on the sidewalk outside the hospital's main entrance, in the same spot she'd parked the day she'd signed the suspension paperwork, and walked out into a parking garage and sat in her car. The sky was clearing, cold, winter-thin, but actual light coming through. "I'm not sure I'm going back." Priya was quiet for a moment. "Because of the clinic?" "Partly." "What's the other part?" She watched a car pull into the hospital's main lot, parked crookedly, a woman getting out with a child on her hip and moving fast toward the entrance. The urgency of ordinary emergency. The world running on its own independent schedule, regardless of what was happening in anyone else's story. "I think I need to decide what I want this to mean," she said. "Not what it was, what it becomes." "You have time," Priya said. "I have about 45 minutes before my clinic shift." Priya laughed. Actually laughed. The real kind. Not the careful kind she'd been using for the past several weeks. It made something in Nora's chest loosen, just slightly. "Go to work," Priya said. She went to work. 3 weeks later, Dina Marsh published what became the definitive account of the Caldwell corruption case, a 4,000-word piece that traced the network from Hale's first documented incident in 2018 through Cade's arrest at the clinic, the suppression of 9 complaints, Esther Hauer's cooperation agreement, Strack's arrest, and the federal investigation's ongoing expansion into the financial records of 2 additional public officials who had not yet been charged. Marsh asked Nora for a comment. Nora gave her 2 sentences, which Marsh used verbatim at the end of the piece. The morning the article ran, Nora's phone received 47 messages before 9 a.m. Journalists, advocacy organizations, 2 nursing associations, 1 law school clinic asking if she'd speak to their students, a documentary filmmaker, and 3 people who identified themselves as having been among the 9. Individuals who had filed complaints that had been buried, who had read the article and wanted to say that they knew, now, that they hadn't been imagining it. She read those 3 messages twice. She was sitting in the break room at the Meridian Street Clinic when a patient's file arrived on the desk outside. A new intake, 41 years old, presenting with what the intake notes described as a possible pneumothorax, which was not something the clinic's equipment was optimally configured to handle. Park appeared in the doorway. "Exam 2. Park said. She put her phone down and went. The man in exam 2 was breathing in the short, careful way of someone managing pain by minimizing thoracic expansion. She introduced herself, started the assessment, talked him through it. Breath sounds diminished on the left. Tracheal midline. She needed imaging that the clinic couldn't provide, and she needed it in the next 20 minutes. She called the ambulance while she kept her hands on his back and kept talking to him, calm, specific, not reassuring in the empty way that good nurses learn to avoid, but factual and present. "You're going to be okay," she told him. "We're getting you to imaging. The thing that's happening is manageable." He looked at her. He was scared in the specific, focused way of a person who understood enough about what was happening to be appropriately afraid. "How do you know?" he asked. "Because I've seen worse," she said, and the honesty of it, the plainness of it, seemed to land better than anything more polished would have. The ambulance arrived in 7 minutes. She was filing the transfer paperwork when Marcus called. She almost didn't answer. She had 2 more patients and the documentation from the transfer to complete, but she saw his name and picked up. "There's a problem," he said. "What kind?" "Hale." His voice had a quality she'd learned to read over the past several weeks. Controlled, not quite flat, the specific register of someone delivering bad news with precision. "He's filing a civil lawsuit against you personally." She stopped moving. "He's claiming that you made false statements to federal investigators that contributed to the destruction of his career, and that the release of the dash cam footage, the anonymous post, can be traced back to sources connected to your legal team." "That's..." She stopped. "Marcus, that's not... I know what it is. It's a pressure tactic. It's the last thing he has. But it means this isn't over. Not yet. And there's one more thing." She waited. "The lawsuit includes a filing that names a witness," he said. "Someone who's prepared to testify that you contacted them before the footage was posted and discussed the dashcam footage explicitly." "I never..." She heard the shape of it before he finished. "Who?" He said the name quietly. She stood in the clinic hallway with the transfer paperwork in her hand and the name landing in her chest like something with a very specific weight. It was Selig. Conrad Selig. She said the name back to Marcus in the clinic hallway, very quietly, and the saying of it did something to the shape of the last several weeks. Rewound it slightly, relit certain moments in a different color. The diner. The cold coffee he hadn't touched. The weight in his posture that she'd read as guilt, and that now required a second interpretation. "He gave you his notes voluntarily," she said. "He did. He came to us." "He did that too." Marcus's voice was careful. "Which is either evidence that this is fabricated, that Hale's team found his name in the public record and built a story around him, or evidence that Selig hedged, that he handed us enough to clear his conscience while also maintaining a relationship with the people he used to protect." She pressed her back against the hallway wall. Through the exam room door, she could hear Park talking to a patient in the low, even rhythm of someone explaining a diagnosis for the second time. The ordinariness of the clinic going on around her felt, in that moment, like a deliberate contrast to the specific chaos currently being delivered through her phone. "Can Hale's lawsuit survive?" she said. "In court? Probably not. The claim that you arranged the footage release is going to fall apart when they can't produce any evidence connecting you or my office to the anonymous account. But that's not the point. The point is that it delays. It forces us to spend time and money responding to something fabricated while he tries to rehabilitate enough of his reputation to make the federal case against him more complicated. And Selig is a witness. If he testifies that you discussed the footage with him before it went public, it creates a narrative the federal investigators have to address. It doesn't have to be true. It just has to be credible enough to generate noise." She thought about the text message. "Withdraw your complaint. Tonight." Thought about the cell tower data Harlow had described. 2 blocks from the precinct, 3 weeks after her arrest. Thought about the fact that Selig's name had been on the short list of people who knew about the oversight complaint. "Marcus," she said. "Yeah." The text message. The one from the prepaid phone. Harlow's team traced the tower data. They said they weren't certain. They weren't certain it was Hale. They didn't say it wasn't Selig. A long pause. She could hear him thinking the way she'd learned to hear it, the specific silence of a lawyer reorganizing. "I'm calling Harlow," he said. "Don't talk to Selig. Don't contact him. Don't respond if he contacts you. Leave it alone until I've spoken to the federal team." "How long?" "Tonight, if I can reach him. Tomorrow morning at the latest." She put her phone in her pocket and went back to her patients. She didn't think about Selig for the next 4 hours, which was not the same as not thinking about him. It was the disciplined redirection of attention toward the thing directly in front of her, which was what the job required, and which she had always been, if nothing else, very good at. Harlow called Marcus at 7 that evening. Marcus relayed the conversation to Nora by text in 3 pieces, sent over the span of 20 minutes, the way someone sends messages when they're still processing the information themselves while they write it. First message. Selig's name came up in their investigation 6 days ago, not as a source, as a subject. Second message. Tower data from the prepaid phone matches a location 2 blocks from Selig's home address in Caldwell, not the precinct. Harlow's team had already identified this. They were developing it separately. Third message. Selig has been in contact with Hale's attorney for approximately 2 weeks. The federal investigators believe he was the source of the leak about the oversight complaint, that he gave Hale's team information about the scope of your filing in exchange for a representation agreement that would protect him from exposure as part of the broader corruption case. She read the 3 messages sitting on her couch at home, in the particular stillness of an apartment at night when something important is being processed. Selig had come to them because he was scared of the federal investigation catching up to him. He'd handed over enough to seem cooperative, enough to establish a relationship, enough to be in the room, while simultaneously providing Hale's team with the specific details they needed to target her. Not out of loyalty to Hale, out of a calculation about his own survival. The man with the cold coffee and the expression of someone trying to unload guilt had not been trying to unload guilt. He'd been managing it. There was a difference, and she'd missed it. She sat with that for a while. She wasn't angry at herself for missing it. Self-recrimination was a luxury she'd never found particularly useful. But she was honest about it. She'd read Selig as a guilty man trying to do a late and partial right thing, and she'd been half correct. The guilt was real. The trying to do right was not. She texted Marcus. What happens to him? His response was immediate. He's been added to the federal case as a subject. Harlow said the representation agreement he made with Hale's attorney was predicated on false information, which makes it void. He's currently without legal cover and in active negotiation with federal prosecutors about cooperation. And Hale's lawsuit? Without Selig as a witness, the filing collapses. The only evidence connecting you to the footage release was Selig's planned testimony. Without it, there's nothing. Harlow's office is contacting the court tomorrow morning. She put the phone down, picked it up again, put it down. Outside her window, the city was doing what it always did, running on its own schedule, indifferent and continuous. Somewhere in a pediatric ward she'd never visited, a 7-year-old boy had gone home weeks ago and was presumably doing whatever 7-year-old boys did when they were alive and not drowning. Somewhere in a federal holding facility, Warren Cade was waiting for his arraignment. Somewhere in a conference room that smelled like institutional coffee, Roy Esterhauer was still talking, turning over the architecture of years of small corruptions in exchange for a reduced sentence. And Garrett Hale, the man who had looked at her kneeling over a coughing child in the mud and decided the right response was handcuffs, was running out of structures to hide behind. She turned off the light and went to sleep. Hale's civil lawsuit was withdrawn 11 days later. It didn't happen with any drama. There was no courtroom moment, no camera, no official statement from Hale or his attorney. The filing simply disappeared from the court docket on a Wednesday morning, the way bad legal theories disappeared when the evidence they depended on stopped existing. Marcus sent her a screenshot of the docket with a single word: done. She was between patients at the clinic. She showed the screenshot to Park, who was passing in the hallway with a stack of patient files and who paused, looked at it, and said, "Good," with the clean economy of someone who didn't see the point in making more of something than it was. Nora found she agreed. The federal case against Hale took shape over the following 3 weeks in the way federal cases did, slowly and thoroughly, each document building on the last. Esterhauer's cooperation had produced a detailed account of the complaint suppression operation, including Hale's specific role in identifying potential complainants and ensuring that reports filed against him reached Esterhauer's desk through channels that bypassed the normal escalation procedures. The financial records Harlow's team had been building tied Strack to a series of transfers from an account connected to Cade that had no legitimate explanation. Strack, facing charges that included abuse of office, obstruction of justice, and misappropriation of public resources, hired 3 attorneys and spent 2 weeks maintaining his innocence through their statements before his own financial records made the maintenance untenable. He fired 2 of the attorneys on a Thursday. He appeared in court on a Friday with the 3rd one and entered a not guilty plea that no one in the room appeared to believe, including, from his expression, his remaining attorney. Hale was charged on a Tuesday. Federal charges, not departmental. Civil rights violations. Obstruction. Conspiracy to suppress official complaints. The charging document was 41 pages and named him specifically in 6 of the 9 documented incidents, including the Canal Bank arrest. Marsh had the story before the official press release, which had become her pattern. She knew sources inside the federal investigation that she had never named and would not name, and the scoops had made her the definitive journalist on the case. Her piece on Hale's federal charging ran at noon and had more detail than the government press release that followed at 2 p.m. Nora read it at the clinic, on her lunch break, sitting in the break room with a sandwich she was actually eating for once. The piece named the 9 people whose complaints had been buried. It named Nora. It named Terrell Watts and Lena Ortega and Declan Mather and Darnell Fitch, and the 5 others whose names had only become public through the federal investigation. It traced the complaint suppression from its earliest documented instance in 2018 through Cade's arrest in the clinic hallway. It was thorough and it was specific, and it was, in the way that good journalism occasionally managed to be, a piece of historical record. She finished her sandwich. She went back to her patients. Colonel Adria Delaney called that evening. "I saw the news," Delaney said. "Everyone did. How are you?" It was a simple question. Delaney didn't ask simple questions without meaning them exactly, which was one of the things that had made her a good commander. "I'm okay," Nora said. "More okay than I expected to be at this stage. Reyes wants to drive up. He and Obi, they want to take you to dinner. Tell them they don't have to." I told them that. They said they know they don't have to. That's sort of the point. She sat down on her couch. Through the window, the city lights were doing their usual thing, so constant, plural, indifferent. "Okay," she said. "Tell them Saturday." Delaney was quiet for a moment. "You did well." "I pulled a kid out of a canal. The federal investigation did the rest. Don't do that." "Do what?" "Make yourself smaller than you were in this." Delaney's voice had the precise quality it got when she was being direct. Not harsh, not soft, just exact. "You didn't just pull a kid out of a canal. You held the line when everyone around you was telling you the line didn't exist. That's not the same thing as being rescued by a federal investigation. That's you, Nora." She didn't respond immediately. "I'm not going back to Caldwell Mercy," she said. "I've been deciding for a while. That's what I've decided." "The clinic?" "Park asked if I'd consider a permanent position. They don't have the budget to pay me what Caldwell Mercy was paying, but they have a grant application pending that would cover most of the difference, and if it doesn't come through—" She paused. "I'll make the math work some other way. I've made harder math work." "Yes," Delaney said, "you have." After the call, she wrote 2 emails. One to Marcus confirming that she would not be returning to Caldwell Mercy and asking him to handle the formal notification, and one to Caldwell Mercy's board of directors, to Kellert and Dubuisson and Crane and Farrow, which she wrote carefully over 40 minutes, and which said, in precise and unambiguous language, that she had decided to pursue a different professional path, that she thanked the hospital for its letter of correction, and that she hoped the board's experience of the past several weeks would inform how it responded the next time a member of its medical staff needed institutional support and didn't get it. She did not send the second email in anger. She sent it in the clear-eyed understanding that institutions learned from documented feedback better than they learned from silence, and that she had spent enough of her life being silent in rooms where speaking might have mattered. She hit send. She closed her laptop. She felt, for the first time in the better part of 2 months, like the situation was something she was standing on top of rather than moving through. The sentencing hearing for Warren Cade was the first of the formal legal proceedings she attended in person. Marcus had asked if she wanted to be there, and she'd said yes without much deliberation. She wasn't interested in spectacle. She was interested in documentation, in being present in the room where the public record was finalized, the way you were present for things that mattered. The courtroom was smaller than she expected. Federal courts always looked more dramatic on television. In person, the wood paneling was slightly worn and the fluorescent lighting was exactly as unflattering as fluorescent lighting always was. And the people in the room, the attorneys, the clerk, the judge, the handful of journalists in the gallery, all had the air of people doing their jobs with the specific competence of people who had done them many times before. Cade sat at the defense table in a gray suit that was too large at the shoulders. He had the particular quality of a man who had spent 6 weeks adjusting to a reality he could not adjust to. His body physically present in the room while the rest of him was still somewhere further back in time, in a hallway or a parking lot or a precinct office where the decisions that led here had seemed manageable. He pled guilty to 2 counts of criminal intimidation and 1 count of obstruction of a federal investigation. The plea agreement had been negotiated over 3 weeks and represented, Harlow had told Marcus, a reduced charge in exchange for Cade's full cooperation with the ongoing investigation into Strack and the financial network. The judge, a woman named Ferrante, who had the unhurried precision of someone who had been doing this long enough to have removed all performance from the process, read the sentencing terms. 32 months, federal facility, no early release eligibility for the first 18. Permanent prohibition from any position involving law enforcement, public safety administration, or access to official government records. When Ferrante finished, she looked at Cade for a moment. "Mr. Cade," she said, "you entered a clinic serving uninsured patients in a medically underserved community and threatened a healthcare provider at gunpoint for doing her job. I want you to understand that the court views that specific act as the most serious component of today's sentencing, not because the other charges are lesser, but because what you chose to target, and why, speaks to a pattern of deliberate harm toward people with limited institutional recourse. The sentence reflects that." Cade said nothing. His attorney said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. Nora sat in the gallery and listened and did not feel triumphant. She felt something quieter than that, the satisfaction of a record being set correctly. The documentation matching the reality. That was what she'd wanted from the beginning, she realized. Not revenge, not public validation, just the accurate version of events, in writing, in rooms that mattered. She drove back to the clinic afterward and worked a half shift. Howard Strack's trial began 6 weeks later and lasted 9 days. The financial records were the foundation of the prosecution's case. 4 years of transfers that could not be explained by salary, inheritance, or any investment the defense could identify, all of them traceable to accounts connected to Cade's network. Esther Howard testified on the 4th day as a cooperating witness, and his testimony was specific and detailed in the way of someone who had spent 3 months working with federal prosecutors to ensure that his account was airtight. Nora did not attend the Strack trial. She followed Marcia's coverage and checked the docket updates Marcus sent, but she did not take time away from the clinic for it. By that point, she had a caseload she was responsible for and a grant application that Park had asked her to help document, a federal community health grant that would cover 2 additional staff positions and an equipment upgrade. And the work of the clinic felt more immediate than the work of the courtroom, which had people handling it who were considerably better at it than she would be. Strack was convicted on all 7 counts. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon. Marcia's alert hit Nora's phone while she was doing intake paperwork on a 60-year-old woman with poorly controlled hypertension and a job that required her to stand for 8 hours a day. She put the phone in her pocket and finished the intake. Strack's sentencing 6 weeks later produced a term of 54 months and a permanent prohibition from public office at any level, along with a requirement to repay the misappropriated funds with interest, a figure that represented nearly 4 years of salary-equivalent transfers and that his attorneys had spent 3 weeks arguing unsuccessfully was excessive. Garrett Hale's federal trial was the last of the proceedings. It began 4 months after Nora's arrest at the Canal Bank, on a gray Tuesday in February that looked almost exactly like the night everything had started. She took the morning off from the clinic and sat in the gallery with Marcus on one side and, unexpectedly, with Reyes and Obi on the other. They had driven up from Fort Harwell that morning without telling her they were coming, arriving at the courthouse steps 20 minutes before the start and presenting themselves with the quiet certainty of people who had decided this was the kind of thing you showed up for. She didn't tell them it meant something. They already knew. The trial lasted 6 days. The federal prosecution's case was built on the 41-page charging document, the Esterhauer testimony, the documented record of 9 suppressed complaints, and the dash cam footage. The official version, pulled from departmental records through the court order Marcus had filed the morning after the arrest. Different from the anonymous clip, but identical in content. Hale's defense argued that his arrest of Nora had been within the scope of his authority and represented a legitimate exercise of his judgment as a responding officer. The defense spent 2 days on this argument. The prosecution spent 40 minutes on the footage, played twice, once at regular speed and once slowed to a quarter speed so that the jury could see, frame by frame, the sequence of events the dash cam had recorded. Hale on the bank, the child motionless, Nora in the water, the compressions, the cycle, the cough, Hale walking toward her, the handcuffs closing. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and returned a verdict on all counts, guilty. The courtroom was not dramatic about it. The verdict was read. The jury was thanked. The session was adjourned. Hale sat at the defense table with the same quality she'd observed in Cade, a man whose body was present in a room where the reality had not yet fully arrived for him. On the courthouse steps afterward, a cluster of journalists had gathered. Marsh was there, notepad out, waiting with the patient alertness of someone who had been covering this story for 4 months and knew it well enough to be still. 2 television cameras. A photographer from a wire service. Marcus had prepared remarks if she wanted to use them. She didn't use them. One of the television journalists asked her how she felt. She thought about how to answer that. Not the performance of how she felt, but the actual answer. "I feel like the record is right," she said. "That's what I wanted. The accurate version of what happened in the right documents where it can't be revised." "What would you want people to take from this?" another journalist asked. She looked at him. He was young, maybe 25, with the slightly anxious energy of someone still figuring out what questions were worth asking. "Document everything," she said. "I know that sounds small. It isn't. It's the reason this case survived. Every text message, every formal complaint, every request, every response. Marcus filed everything and kept copies and dated them. And when the other side started building a version of events that wasn't true, we had the actual version in writing. The people whose complaints were buried, they didn't have that. Not through any fault of their own. They just didn't have anyone who knew how to build that kind of record." She paused. "That's the thing worth changing. Not just the officers, the access. Who gets the kind of legal support that knows how to document?" She walked down the steps. Reyes fell into step beside her on the left, Obi on the right, Marcus slightly behind, and they walked to the parking lot in the pale February light, and she was aware of how strange it was, that this was what the end of something looked like. Not a closing ceremony, not a transformation, just people walking to their cars on a cold morning while the world ran on its own uninterrupted schedule. Hale's sentencing came 8 weeks later. 58 months. Federal facility. Permanent prohibition from law enforcement at any level, in any capacity, in any jurisdiction. His pension, the 22 years of accumulated benefit he'd built at the Caldwell Police Department, was forfeited under federal civil rights conviction statute. Nora was not in the courtroom for the sentencing. She was at the clinic in exam room 2 with a 4-year-old who had an ear infection and a mother who'd been trying to get an appointment for 3 days and kept getting told the earliest availability was 2 weeks out. Nora sat on the small stool beside the exam table and looked at the child's ear and explained to the mother what she was seeing and what the treatment would be, and answered the 3 follow-up questions the mother asked without rushing any of them. The mother was 26 years old and had taken 2 buses to get to the clinic and had to be back at her second job by 4. She said thank you at the end with the particular quality of someone who meant it in excess of the words. "You don't have to thank me," Nora said. "I know I don't have to," the woman said. That's the point. Nora walked her to the front desk and went back to the hallway and stood there for a moment with the next patient's file in her hand. Marcus had texted her the sentencing result while she was in the exam room. She'd read it between patients, standing in the supply closet the way she always stood in the supply closet when she needed 2 minutes, and she'd registered it. 58 months, pension forfeited, and felt the specific, unglamorous satisfaction of an accurate outcome. Not justice the way it got described in speeches. Justice the way it actually arrived. Incremental, procedural, imperfect, late, and real. She went to her next patient. The grant came through in March. Park told her on a Thursday morning, appearing in the doorway of the exam room Nora had just finished with, holding a printout with the particular expression of someone trying not to smile too much. Federal Community Health Grant, Park said. Full amount. 2 new positions and the imaging equipment. Nora looked at her. The grant application, Park said, included a section on community impact. The reviewer's note specifically cited the clinic's response during a law enforcement incident on the premises as evidence of organizational resilience under pressure. She paused. I thought you'd want to know that what happened here in October wasn't just something that happened to us. It became something that helped us. Nora took the printout, read it, handed it back. When do we start the hiring process? She said. Park's expression completed the smile she'd been containing. Monday. The month after the grant announcement, a woman named Lena Ortega, one of the 9, one of the names Marsh had published, a woman who had filed a complaint against Hale in 2021 and had it buried within 2 weeks, came to the Meridian Street Clinic with a referral from a community organization. She was 44 years old and had avoided medical care for 2 years because her previous experience with institutions had produced outcomes that made her reluctant to approach them. Nora did her intake assessment. She didn't mention that she knew Lena's name, that she'd read about her, that Lena's buried complaint was part of the documented record that had helped build the federal case. That information was Lena's to bring up or not, and it wasn't the point of the appointment. At the end of the intake, when Nora had finished the assessment and was writing the follow-up recommendations, Lena said, "You're the nurse from the canal." Yes. Lena looked at her for a moment. The complaint I filed. Did it? It was part of the case, Nora said. It's in the record. It's real. It wasn't buried permanently. Lena nodded once, slowly. She looked like a woman receiving information she'd needed for 2 years and hadn't known how to find. I thought it just disappeared, she said. Things that get documented don't disappear, Nora said. Even when they're supposed to, even when someone tries. She capped her pen. We'll see you in 3 weeks for the follow-up. Make sure you bring the medication list. The boy's name was Eli. She learned this 6 months after the canal, when his mother finally reached her. Not through Marcus, not through any official channel, but through Marsh, who had Nora's consent to pass along a message if the family ever asked again. They'd been asking since the night of the accident. It had taken this long for the right path to open. His mother's name was Tamsin. She was 34, a teacher, and she called Nora on a Sunday evening in early April with the particular hesitation of someone who had rehearsed what she wanted to say and was now discovering that rehearsing hadn't quite prepared her. I've been trying to find the right words for 6 months, Tamsin said. You don't have to have right words, Nora said. No, Tamsin stopped, collected herself. He asks about you. Eli. He asks about the woman who got him out. I've been showing him the news coverage, but he's 7, so most of it doesn't land the way he needs it to. What does he need? He wants to know why you went in. He wants to know why you didn't walk past. Nora sat with the question for a moment. It was not a question she had a clean answer to. Not because she hadn't thought about it, but because the honest answer was more complicated than 7-year-olds usually wanted, and probably more complicated than most adults wanted either. Tell him it wasn't a decision, she said. It just looked like someone needed help, and I knew how to help, so I did. Tamsin was quiet for a moment. He'll understand that. Yeah, she said. Kids usually do. They arranged to meet the following weekend. Not at the clinic, not at a courthouse, not in any of the locations the past 6 months had assembled around the story. At a park, on a Saturday morning, the kind of low-stakes neutral ground that belonged to ordinary life. Eli was small and serious-faced and wearing a jacket with a dinosaur on the back. He looked at her the way children looked at people who existed in both story and reality, checking, reconciling, making sure the proportions matched. "You're shorter than I thought," he said. She laughed. She couldn't help it. It was too direct and too accurate. "Yeah," she said. "Most people are." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "I unbuckled the seatbelt." "You did," she said. "That was you." He seemed to need that confirmed. He nodded once, as though filing it away. They sat on a park bench, the three of them, Tamsin, Eli, and Nora, in the April light, which was real and warm and gave no indication of having any opinion about the months that had preceded it. Eli ran toward the playground after 15 minutes, in the way of children who have completed their investigation and are satisfied with the results. Tamsin watched him go. "I don't know how to—" she started. "You don't have to," Nora said. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you'd driven past." Nora watched Eli reach the jungle gym and start climbing with the absolute confidence of someone whose body had forgotten, or perhaps never remembered, that it had once stopped. "Don't think about that version," she said. "It didn't happen. Because you were there." "Because I was there," she agreed, "and because he unbuckled the seatbelt." Tamsin looked at her. "Does it feel worth it? Everything after, everything it cost you?" It was the real question, the one that the news coverage and the federal proceedings and the courthouse steps and all of it had been building toward without quite asking directly. Nora watched Eli at the top of the climbing structure, looking out at the park with the expression of someone surveying a territory that was entirely his. "I've been thinking about this since October," she said, "what it cost and what it was worth." She paused. "The honest answer is that it wasn't a trade I made. I didn't go into that canal and pull him out knowing what would come after. I just did the thing that needed to be done because I knew how to do it and he needed it done. And everything after? Everything after was the cost of other people's choices, not mine. Hale chose to put handcuffs on me. The hospital chose to suspend me. Esterhauer chose to bury 9 complaints. I didn't choose any of that." She looked at Tamsin. "What I chose, consistently, the whole time, was to not let someone else's bad choice rewrite what had actually happened. That's the only thing I controlled." Tamsin absorbed this. "You make it sound simple," she said. "It wasn't. It was expensive and frightening, and there were 3 weeks in there where I wasn't sure which direction it was going to fall." She watched Eli start to climb down, carefully, one rung at a time. But the thing about documenting everything, about holding the accurate version of events in your hands and refusing to let it get revised, that part wasn't complicated. It was just work. The kind of work that doesn't require you to be extraordinary. It just requires you to not give up. Eli reached the ground and turned toward them. From 50 feet away, he raised one hand in a wave that was unself-conscious and complete, the wave of someone who had determined that everything was fine. Nora raised her hand back. Oh. She thought about what Delaney had said. You held the line when everyone around you was telling you the line didn't exist, and she understood it differently now than she had the night it was said. At the time, it had felt like a compliment. Now it felt like a description of something more ordinary and more important than a compliment. The line was documentation. The line was accuracy. The line was the insistence that what had actually happened was the thing that got written down, not the version that was more convenient for the people with institutional power to have written down. She had not been special in knowing how to hold it. She had been trained, in various rooms and contexts over 14 years, to understand that the difference between an outcome that could be corrected and an outcome that couldn't was almost always the paper trail, the form filed correctly, the request submitted through the right channel, the timestamp on the screenshot, the copy sent to the second party before the first party could classify it. 9 people had tried to hold the same line. Their complaints had been buried twice, once by Cade, once by Esterhauer, not because the line was impossible to hold, but because they hadn't had the specific kind of help that made holding it viable. That was the part that mattered. Not her. Not her canal rescue or her military record or the footage or the federal case. The access, the 48-hour legal response, the attorney who knew which requests would surface which documents before the window closed. She had worked in enough emergency departments and enough field conditions to know that the most important variable in any crisis was not who the most capable person in the room was. It was who was in the room at all. Capability without presence was a theoretical exercise. She thought about the grant, about the 2 new positions, about the grant application section on community impact, and the federal reviewer who had cited the clinic's response to a law enforcement incident as evidence of organizational resilience. The clinic was present in a neighborhood where presence was the rarest resource. That was the work, not spectacular, not recoverable to a single dramatic moment. Just present every morning for whoever walked through the front door before they had exhausted their options. She had tried the spectacular. She had done the canal bank and the federal courthouse and the gallery seats at 4 separate legal proceedings. She was done with spectacular. She wanted the ordinary, reliable, durable presence of someone who showed up and knew what to do and didn't look for a camera to record it. In May, a coalition of community advocacy organizations in Caldwell hosted a public forum on police accountability and institutional reform. They asked Nora to speak. She almost said no. She had a full caseload that week, and Park needed documentation for a secondary grant application by Friday. But Marcus told her it mattered not just for the room that would be there, but for the record of who had been willing to show up, and she understood records. She spoke for 11 minutes. She was not eloquent in the way of people who had trained themselves to be eloquent. She was direct and specific, and she did not tell anyone how to feel about what she said. She told them about the 9 people whose complaints had been buried. She told them that each of those 9 had done the right thing. They had filed, they had reported, they had followed the process. The process had failed them. Not their courage, not their judgment, the process. She told them that the difference between her situation and theirs was not that she had done something better or braver. She had had a lawyer who filed a request within 48 hours and knew which request to file. She had had a camera at an angle that captured the footage before it could be classified. She had had, by chance and by history, a particular set of people who knew her record and were willing to say so publicly. None of those things should have been rare. All of them were. She told them what the federal case had established, in formal language, in official documents that were part of the public record, that the suppression of complaints was systematic, that it had been protected at multiple levels, and that it had ended not because the system had corrected itself, but because external pressure, public, legal, and federal, had made continuation impossible. She told them what she'd told the journalist on the courthouse steps: document everything. Not because documentation was sufficient, it wasn't sufficient, but it was the foundation that everything else required, and without it, the accurate version of events was always available for revision by whoever held the pen. She said one more thing before she sat down. "The boy I pulled out of the canal is 7 years old," she said. "He's going to grow up in this city. Whatever this city decides to become, whatever reforms follow from this case or don't, whatever institutions change or don't, he's going to live inside it. So will the children of every person in this room." She looked at the audience. A couple of hundred people, an ordinary Tuesday evening crowd, people who had made time because they'd decided the subject was worth it. I'm not in a position to promise you that systems change because one case goes right. I'm not going to make that promise. What I can tell you is that the case went right because people refused to let the wrong version become the official version. That's not heroism. That's just work. And it's available to anyone who's willing to do it. She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment, and then it wasn't. She drove home afterward in her 10-year-old sedan with the cracked rear bumper and the heater that had been fixed in December. $140, deferred for 2 months, finally handled on a Thursday afternoon between shifts. The city moved past her windows in the particular rhythm it had at 9 in the evening. Slower than daytime, busier than late night, the particular in-between time of a city that hadn't fully settled into itself yet. She thought about the canal, the cold, the particular quality of that moment when she'd been running toward the bank and her thinking had not quite caught up with her body yet, when she'd been moving purely on the accumulated instinct of everything she knew how to do. She'd been running toward the thing that needed to be done. She was still running toward it. The road was wet with the remains of afternoon rain, the kind that came and went in May without making much of itself. Her headlights caught the shine of it, ordinary, continuous, already becoming the past. She drove home. She had a shift in the morning, and a grant report due by Friday, and a follow-up appointment with Lena Ortega, and a message from Reyes she hadn't returned yet, and a city outside her window full of people who were, right now, in the ordinary business of getting from one day to the next. She'd been dismissed. She'd been stripped of the job she'd built and the reputation she'd built, and the right to walk through a door she'd walked through 300 times. She'd been handcuffed in the mud while a child coughed beside her, and she'd been threatened in a hallway, and she'd been made into a story without being asked. And she had not revised herself to match what the situation required her to be. She had stayed exactly who she was. Imperfect, trained, tired in the normal way, running on the normal fuel of someone who had decided a long time ago that the right move in most situations was to go toward the thing that needed doing rather than away from it. She had not been extraordinary. She had simply refused to be less than she was. That was the whole of it. That was the thing worth knowing. The heater worked. The road was wet. She drove home.